Life is unfair, but usually we don't think too deeply about it, and we can live our lives without really questioning our privileges and the mere luck that got us to the place we are right now. With so much poverty, wars, and hunger in the world, we are lucky to be watching and making YouTube videos with a roof above our heads. Today we want to take a look at unfairness in the context of socioeconomic status, demographics, and geography. Opportunities and context are what has made inequality and injustice one of the most prevalent problems that has stuck with humanity for this long. It isn't like we haven't tried to solve it either, and there are plenty of ways in which people have thought of solving it, but we are yet to see a practical example of these concepts working as intended. So, in this video, we will start by exploring some of the ways inequality can be seen, focusing on how context influences this inequality, bringing personal examples and research into it. We will move on to explore theoretical solutions to bridge different types of inequality, how some have been applied in practice, their weak points, and what we can learn from each of them.
Starting with how context affects our education, we can first look at the quality of education in different countries. Needless to say, wealthier countries see better possibilities for education, showing much higher test scores, average, etc. Note the key word here, possibilities. Of course, that just coming from a higher income country does not mean that you have access to the best education. It just means that there are more schools with better education and accessing them is much easier than in poorer countries. However, better education usually comes with more expenses, and even then, the availability depends on the city you live in. So, to exemplify a bit, I studied the IB in Mexico. However, like most people, I don't come from a big city, and there are exactly 0 IB schools in my hometown. Yet, I was fortunate enough to live next to a city with the grandiose amount of 2 IB schools, where most people scored between 22 and 26 out of 45, at least from what I saw in my generation and from before. Yes, that means that a lot of people did not pass, around half probably, and even then, we were privileged if you call having an unsatisfactory IB education a privilege, and well, it is. We were privileged enough to have an IB school in our state and be able to attend, most of us with a scholarship. Here, you can see the uneven distributions of IB schools in Mexico, most of them with poor average scores, and around 37 out of 117 of them, likely the best ones because of the concentration, are located in Mexico City. And Mexico isn't even in the worst position either. According to Xu, the IB is seen as the rich people's alternative to education in China, being considered an easier form of education and a slightly less competitive one that you need to pay to form a part of. On the other hand, as of 2015, all of Africa had a measly 76 IB schools according to Bono, and throughout the world, there are many countries that do not even have any IB schools. In many places, IB schools and other forms of international education are seen as a sort of elite education, a rich people's club, even when the schools do not hold the same standards of the IB education, for example. Yet, everyone gets put under the same grading system, same exams, and same grade boundaries. Whenever there's a big enough discrepancy, they add different grade boundaries by region, with the regions being so broad that it doesn't really account for the important differences. How is it that an underprepared school or country in America is pitted against the best United States schools? Well, I will assume this is likely because it benefits those paying a premium for the better education, and that would let them move more smoothly throughout the best universities, while giving a false sense of hope for those in lower ranked schools. As it is put by the IB itself on its paper for predictors of academic success, 42% of academic performance variance was predicted by different schools, while only 58% was within schools. And while most of their predictors for academic success are obvious, like studying for exams or those sort of things, well, there are some less obvious ones. These less obvious aspects are invisible to most of us, such as how having less time for IB means having worse grades, with some students needing to work in order to afford school, and some schools having less available resources for the IB. For example, not being able to choose my subjects in my school, and having unqualified teachers and less staff than most schools. Different access to tutors and studying resources can also be a reason, as well as economic reasons or most quality resources being in English. So, it is clear that education access does vary a lot. In first world countries, their national education is sometimes good enough to be validated internationally, and sometimes international validity is unnecessary because there's no need to move. However, some of the only hope as a third world country resident lies in international education to access good opportunities, which is usually reserved to people with more resources and, in rare cases with scholarships, very talented people. Even then, there is no guarantee to succeed, considering how even some international education schools have a poor education for first world standards, and even the access to these is generally geographically imbalanced and expensive, with the best schools being usually available in large and richer cities as shown by Dixon et al. And Ida in their respective papers. And just like I had to move cities to get an international education, accessing better opportunities in another country implies moving there. This process is called brain drain, and in a nutshell, it is when highly skilled and educated people leave their country for one with better opportunities in their field, usually from third world countries to first world countries. This happens within poorer regions of first world countries too, although it is a simpler process that does not imply visas and has somewhat less competition, simplifying other similar hurdles. Brain drain usually happens as a result of countries not supporting their talent, which tends to happen because of a lack of resources that is usually paired with other issues like corruption. This makes the disparity between developing and developed countries even wider, as most talent flows to developed countries, particularly those with more opportunities and lower entrance barriers, usually English speaking, with higher scholarships and grants, fair and transparent immigration policies, internship availability, and postgrad work opportunities globally and within the country. This is part of what has made the US a popular migrant destination for so long, at least according to Eder et al., although we are yet to see the effects of the new visa change trends. To give some more information, Lokier et al. State that the highest brain drain rates are seen in small island countries and the least developed, with the lowest rates in large landlocked developing countries. The highest average rates come from sub-Saharan Africa with 13%, Latin America and the Caribbean with 11%, and the Middle East and North Africa with 10%. Needless to say, given the changes they have to face, international students have a higher intrinsic motivation than local students, stemming from pressure to succeed and keep the visa status, as Chu and Ni point out. As migration from third world countries to first world countries has steadily increased from 1.1 to 1.5% between the 90s and the 2000s, and the population of skilled migrants has increased too, is there a hope for third world countries? Well, fortunately, the skilled emigration rate has decreased from 7.7 to 7.3%, so even if the proportion of skilled migrants increase, education has increased, and the skilled immigration rate seems to be declining. Similarly, even if most people do not look back after leaving their home country, many do want to improve their home country, even if it implies a great sacrifice that might affect their opportunities. With all this in mind, how can we fight inequality?
First of all, there are many forms of inequality, and addressing either of them is not a trivial task. There are many interesting ones that we will not address that do appear in our resources and we are definitely willing to discuss in the comments, such as relational equality, equality of welfare, resources, capabilities to enjoy life, or income and rights. Many different ideologies and thought experiments exist to address inequality, and they are interesting in their own right, so check them all out if you want. One of our resources will have solutions to address different inequalities if you want to check it out, though we will only focus on one of its sections, but for now, let's focus on equality of opportunities. For this solution, we decided to use John Rawls' philosophy on justice. Broadly, Rawls proposes formal equality of opportunity and fair equality of opportunity. The latter is an extreme version of the former, and I shall now explain them in a nutshell. Formal equality of opportunity is the baseline of meritocracy, as it broadly states that everyone should have access to apply to vacants, like a job or at a school, and only those with the most merit should get the vacancy. Most democracies use, or at least they would if nepotism, selfishness, and discrimination weren't the thing. Anyways, it is seen as basic morality in most places, and it says that two people with the same merit should have the same opportunity in their field. Still, it doesn't address wealth gaps and how our context can influence our ability to succeed through access to better education and opportunities, as we discussed before. So it does not state how to measure merit, nor does it address the core of inequality, which is the different access to opportunities, but this is where fair equality of opportunity comes in. The fair equality of opportunity concept is Rawls' way to create a classless society, where everybody has an equal access and choice to education, whether they decide to only study compulsory education or to get a PhD in fucking chocolate studies or whatever they want. Rawls proposes this in opposition to the unspoken fact that people with money and status have an advantage over those who do not, by achievement of fully government-controlled education. However, Rawls addresses that there are many unaddressed problems if we choose to either keep the current state of things or if we decide to take on his ideals. Most parents try to give their children a competitive advantage, simply because of how nature works, but this will clash with Rawls' ideals. meaning that parent-child interactions should be limited or supervised to a degree, so there will be a state observation in family life when it comes to a child's educational upbringing. Not to mention that a child may not be mature enough to make the best choices for themselves, and neither can a parent, even if parents, or at least decent ones, make decisions according to what they think is better for the child. Of course, there isn't an objective way to deal with this, so this is an error in the system that hasn't been addressed, possibly because of its difficulty and really heavy moral implications. But now comes the question, how did Rawls even think of this idea? At the core of fair equality of opportunity lies the question, what if society could build itself from scratch? And to guide his answer, Rawls creates the veil of ignorance. This veil is meant to make you unable to know your position in society. Imagine that you do not know your gender, race, ethnicity, social class, economic status, blah 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 blah, and even natural skills such as talent in different fields. Rawls argues that with this thinking, we would not be able to build a new society to our advantage, unlike laws that are sometimes built to benefit those in power. Yet there are still problems with how to address talent, because some people are naturally more talented in some areas. So would it be fair that opportunity relies on talent if talent is really random? I would argue that Rawls' idea of education would expand to other types of education too, such as access to sports, competition training, or other types of competitions. Nowadays, some actions that align to fair equality opportunity are being applied too. For example, affirmative action and diversity quotas are meant to bridge opportunity gaps for marginalized groups by making it so that every group has the same representation and eventually the same opportunities by making every group have similar starting points in this sense, since there is no longer a systemic disadvantage as representation will theoretically bridge wealth gaps too. So, Rawls' rant was very cool and all, but what criticism and thoughts do we have about them and what do we individually take home?
This is a very neat idea, yet the extremes challenge what we consider our core values and morals. For example, how are we meant to address talent and the fact that parents want to see their children succeed? After all, these are natural ways in which inequality occurs, yet to address it, we would need to have government intervention for family and friend interactions, which is already questionable to say, let alone to put in practice. For talent, it will be even harder to address, as there is no guideline on how to morally make everyone have the same talent, unless some sort of human genetic intervention were to be used, which would yet to be another very big moral topic. Another thing to consider is how there are some different ways to learn, so using the same education type and model might benefit some at the expense of others falling behind. Similarly, I don't think the veil of ignorance is perfect either. Although it is a great tool in theory, we cannot practically think of every aspect that gives us an advantage, as some of them are so ingrained in our culture and context that we might not think of them as an advantage. Instead, we think of it as a default. This means that the veil of ignorance will not help in these cases, because we will still have our subconscious think of who we are now without the veil. Still, many parts of Rawls' theory stands on very strong grounds, like some ways to achieve equality through some more actionable steps like affirmative action. There are other things that are also important but harder to solve, such as having quality government education without it influencing our freedom of thought, or eliminating the advantage of having more resources or status to move to a classless society. But even these are points of contention, as a classless society is not commonly thought as strictly morally correct, so, to be applied, fair equality of opportunity needs some reworking too.
On my end, as Rawls points out himself, we are not considering, and in fact I think it is impossible to take into consideration any negative impacts of this new model. One of the biggest drawbacks that I can possibly see is that by giving a freedom of choice to students, whether this is what they want to study or whether this is what and when to study, a child might be overwhelmed with choices and can even regret them if he grows tired or bored of his selected path. At one point, I wished to be a race car driver or even a janitor according to my parents, and I doubt I'd be enjoying the life I am right now if I pursued any of those careers. So I don't think a child should be able to choose that freely, even if at the point at which I was a kid I would have loved to try it out. Which might be a fun way to start testing out whether you like a thing or not actually. Maybe the early years of school could be a type of kidsania while teaching you the basics for everything. But at the same time you try out stuff like driving or cooking or whatever. Let's imagine for a moment that we're all able to go study and whatever we want. If every aspiring designer or chef wishes to go to the best cooking or design school, demand will be at 100% for that specific school. We could eliminate this problem by either just having one school and repeating this problem with teachers, since everybody wants the best teacher, and at that point it is impossible to give everybody the same teachings, and by natural skills or luck, inevitably there will be a better or worse student simply because of talent. I am just dancing around the main point though. Unfortunately, there are many people who are simply more talented, as I said, just because of nature, I definitely do not excel at math or sports and many other areas, but I like to think that I am a decent designer and video editor. And I think that diversity is key to a healthy society, but because of the same diversity, even if we did have this fair access to educational opportunities, people will have natural advantages and disadvantages, and at that point, how do we decide who works harder? The one who struggles to learn something or the one who gives it their all to a subject, although they already excel at it? We like to think that the hard worker should receive it, but I'm not sure if this is part of the meritocratic culture I have developed myself in. I don't think anybody will step down from their job just because another person can do it better. I design and edit videos because I like it, not particularly because I'm good or perfect at it. But this thought experiment, as well as many other laws and propositions, does not accomplish much if we cannot apply it globally. And then, what options do we have to apply laws uniformly all around the world?
Well, to answer this question, we first need to take a look at cosmopolitanism, as we will see it heavily aligns with our ideas on equality. Cosmopolitanism has had a rather long history, and though it isn't the focus of this video, it is interesting to see, and you can dive deeper on it in the resources below if you want to. In a nutshell, it is broadly defined as the belief that every human being should live in the same community. Of course, this definition means that people interpret it differently, dividing it into mainly moral, political, and cultural cosmopolitanism. So let's see what these have to offer. First up, we have moral cosmopolitanism, which is the most common type of it. It states that we have a fundamental moral commitment to helping other human beings, usually through a Kantian moral framework rather than a utilitarian one, since the idea of cosmopolitanism is very aligned to Kant's perspective of human morals and duty rather than maximizing happiness. The strict form of moral cosmopolitanism states that we owe this help to any human at the same level, basically saying that we don't owe more to friends, family, or close community. The moderate form of this cosmopolitanism states that we owe this help to everyone, but we might owe it more to friends, family, and close community. For the strict form, main counter-arguments state that it is harder to perform civic duties for a group of people with which we don't share or feel as attached to, compared to people like family and friends, to whom we tend to feel a sort of natural priority towards. This criticism relies more on the effective application of strict moral cosmopolitanism, and the main counter-arguments for moderate moral cosmopolitanism simply are the strict moral cosmopolitanism view that doesn't put priorities of those closer to us, as well as nationalist ideologies that mostly state that we do not owe anything to anyone other than those of our nationality, naturally disagreeing with the strict form too. As for political cosmopolitanism, in its strict form, it states that there should be a centralized world state, basically a world government instead of the current national system, be it a federalized government or not. In its moderate form, it states that there should only be international institutions and organizations to ensure that certain laws are obeyed globally, with the organization's power varying by how strict the moderate view is. Even some moral cosmopolitans disagree with political cosmopolitanism, and we will expand on these points of contention later because they're the most relevant to this section. The main argument that we don't expand on later is from Rawls, who argues that political cosmopolitanism is too focused on states instead of genuine interests of individuals. He argues that states don't always act to benefit individuals, and asks whether states are indispensable to pursue justice in moral cosmopolitanism's true fashion. Finally, cultural cosmopolitanism says that we are not bound by our culture or cultures, even if we tend to be attached to it, and that we can and should evolve from seeing and interacting with other cultures, even if this might even lead to a loss of culture. The main counter-argument states that when interacting with other cultures, we tend to do so in an unequal way, which is an interesting point we will explore more on the next section. The other argument says that minority cultures should have rights to be protected too, as otherwise it might lead to a loss of culture because of disinterest and heavy alignment to other cultures because of social pressures to align to them. Well, after exploring cosmopolitanism, we can see that political and cultural cosmopolitanism is what's most applicable to these video sources, although moral cosmopolitanism provides a guideline. Well, we'll explore cultural cosmopolitanism later, mostly working on the observation of unequal interactions, and we will talk about political cosmopolitanism now. So, we see that the modern political cosmopolitanism is currently being applied in most world organizations, like the United Nations, which applies moral and political, the International Criminal Court, the International Red Cross, although this one is mostly moral, and others. Of course, these don't perfectly align with cosmopolitanism, and even they have their criticisms of their own. Now, let's tackle the criticisms of world government, which is the strict form of political cosmopolitanism. People tend to advocate for it under the premise that it is the ideal political organization, or that it is the only way to solve some world problems. However, people argue that the feasibility of it is based on utopian thinking, and it is an impractical form of political organization because states want to remain sovereign, and there is anarchy in the world with states that will be hard to break. We will see other arguments under the feasibility, desirability, and necessity layer as they are addressed below. These arguments come from the article A Cosmopolitan Case Against World Government, in which Somin proposes many arguments against world government, unsurprisingly. This is one of our personal favorites, so give it a read if you have time. Regressing a bit, Somin states that he disagrees with nationalism and that he is in favor of open borders and immigration, along with free trade, facts that will be useful later. First, Somin states that a world government will kill foot voting, as it is impossible to escape the world government's jurisdiction. He considers that immigration is important for people living under corrupt, backward, or oppressive regimes. Unfortunately, corrupt and oppressive regimes tend to be the ones with more immigration restrictions. Under less extreme circumstances, can also be a more effective alternative to democratic voting, as it provides the option to choose what government we want to live in, from the available options of course, instead of democratic voting, which offers the possibility of living under the government we want. Still, a world government will facilitate migration barriers and thus keep foot voting only if federalism still applies, though a world government isn't necessary to break these barriers. However, governments tend to become more centralized as problems arise, meaning that federal entities might lose power and foot voting becomes even less effective. And if you disagree with the global rules, well, then there is nowhere to go to where you agree with the jurisdiction more. The problem would be even worse if the government became a tyranny, which isn't impossible because of the probabilities would increase as time passes. And even if it starts as a democracy, something that we can see from history, well, tyranny still arises in certain cases. Somin also argues for interjurisdictional competition, as a world government affects diversity through its one-size-fits-all policies, which is ineffective in our diverse world, a fact that can be seen even in countries and how jurisdictions may affect minorities. He argues competition between countries is beneficial as well, since it attracts more business, investment, trade, and productive workers. As innovations are found in more powerful countries to keep a lead, these innovations are applied to less powerful countries to advance. But if there is a world government, innovation becomes less of a priority, as countries don't have that much of an incentive to compete because, well, they don't even exist. In this case, it will also make tyranny likelier, as development stops, and if the population keeps growing, people might become poorer and less informed, which are some of the bases for tyranny. Somin also states that a world government would exacerbate the weaknesses of democracy. This is seen through political ignorance arising from how little voters think their vote matters, with some deciding not to inform themselves because of it, and how catching up with policies becomes harder when trying to inform yourself. And well, unsurprisingly, a world government will be more complex, so it will be harder to care about being informed considering how difficult it will be. His final argument is just that it isn't necessary to implement a world government to solve our current global problems, as voluntary cooperation, even if it's just done by bigger nations, or even voluntary agreements can prove to be effective against genuine threats to common interests in countries. However, self-interest might affect their efficacy. This is why he notes that these solutions aren't perfect, but he concludes by saying that a world government is not perfect either, and it should be considered more deeply before people advocate for it, and that it should be reconsidered if current solutions fail to tackle possibly greater future global threats.
Moving on, we will finally see current criticisms of moderate political cosmopolitanism, mostly seeing failures and criticism towards the UN and other organizations, along with some of their strengths. For the first article, it states that the UN usually falls behind promises and expectations, although they have achieved significant goals in preventing crises in the past. It argues that this might be to the lack of coercive or military powers, since it is a way to ensure legitimacy and efficiency to ensure jurisdictions are applied and aid is given during humanitarian crises, meaning that imposing tariffs and other economic sanctions isn't enough. Next, it states that the Security Council is paralyzed in action, usually by those with veto power that have very different ideologies and priorities, so there is little progress from passing new jurisdictions. The article also discusses regional organizations, which are groups of countries moving toward partial or complete unification and interdependence. though they might focus on different aspects like how the EU focuses on economics for the most part. It argues that regional similarities are often more effective than global organizations because of more shared goals and context, leading to more effective partnerships, although they start by first having more conflicts because of increased exposure to other nations. It eventually decreases as interdependence and understanding does, even being more effective at containing and resolving conflicts than the UN itself, by preventing and addressing them more directly rather than deterring. The other article states that the UN is only as effective as its members allow it to be, providing two new arguments. The first is one that applies to all international law, claiming sovereignty. This makes states able to not agree to laws or conventions, claiming that it would affect their territorial integrity, which might be true but might also be misused. Next, it expands on how veto power leads to more inequality by giving power to 5 nations, even when equality of nations is meant to be a core UN value. Some nations argue more members should be added, and it should be a 2/3 vote instead of unanimous power. Finally, the article talks about how the EU is a more effective organization and could have unified Europe economically, although it did fail because of the other circumstances. Its weaknesses stem from the refugee crisis, as states started leaving the EU because they were burdened economically by other countries. The EU's inability to redistribute wealth and the economic problems within some states led to some mistrusting the EU, leading to them leaving the Union. After this hefty section, we shall now impose our opinions, and well, there is quite a bit to talk about, so bear with us. We wrote our own opinions and realized that we agree with what the other one says, and we decided to overlap the opinions into one to create our combined take. So, we used to think that world government would make sense, but reading the counter-arguments, particularly summons, and the distinction between strict political cosmopolitanism and other types of cosmopolitanism, we realized it wasn't as great as we thought. From Summon, we consider his criticism fair for the most part. First, we disagree with food voting effectiveness currently, since it is reserved for a privileged few considering all the difficulties of moving from your country, from visas to expenses to the change in culture. Of course, under open border migration this would be easier, but we are considering the status quo. Where we disagree with it the most is on innovation and competition, as even when interjurisdictional competition does lead to innovation, it will only be fair if the competition itself were fair. By this, we mean that everyone should be able to choose to innovate, which is not the current case, where those who succeed are usually those with resources, losing on innovation with poorer countries and regions. Interjurisdictional competition expects that these regions can and will use other countries' innovations to improve, though brain drain was another issue we previously mentioned, so there are less people to apply these innovations. Further affecting competition, after moving, immigrants tend to receive less than they would deserve for their performance in their new context if they were locals, be it because they couldn't price their innovations right so they buy their patents for less, and in other cases people moving in to take jobs for cheaper, which reduces jobs available for locals, an often cited reason against immigration. So in general, regulations are necessary to ensure a fair competition, although this wouldn't be necessary in a perfect world where we don't take advantage from others, though this is far away from where we are right now. So we think the better solution is international laws and organizations that ensure human rights are met, along with other important regulations and aid during humanitarian crisis. This would be like a better UN, eliminating veto power because of how much it breaks the concept of democracy and equality they advocate so much for, plus how it affects possible progress of contrasting beliefs in countries that have the power of the veto. It would also have a military of its own, considering how much of a flawed world we live in, as military coercive power is necessary to ensure a successful implementation of laws and the ability to act during crisis in more resistant or violent countries, and ironically preventing war escalation in some cases. As for how to finance this, I am rather sad to inform you that it will rely on voluntary cooperation or, in the worst case, taxes from the government. Of course, regional organizations would still exist, as their effectiveness is higher given the more shared context and goals in comparison to a global organization, even if some criticism of world organizations apply to them too, though to a lesser degree. Well, that should pretty much cover all of our thoughts on effective world jurisdictions, but there is one more thing to address: inequality of interactions between people in a global context. This is a more abstract concept, meaning it will be harder to pinpoint and discuss, but hopefully we captured its meaning correctly, so let's move on to globalization and planetarity.
First, globalization should not be confused with globalism, as globalization refers to a process and globalism refers to a way of thought. Globalism is the ideology supporting globalization, which is the process seen almost as unstoppable by many, even with some people disagreeing with globalization, as it can be seen with certain countries focusing on nationalist efforts and actions to make it harder to join their country. While I get the general point of I don't want people stealing jobs or terrorizing populations, it is not being applied in a way that benefits the most people, and it is being enforced in an oppressive way and dehumanizing too. And as many weaknesses as globalization may have, even from non-nationalist perspectives, which we will dive upon shortly, we believe it is a better option than nationalism and isolationism, A global economy and a shared world in which we are able to interact and learn from each other is a better way than staying in my home eating tacos, as I would rather taste a burger or ramen from time to time. But as we mentioned, globalism supporting the current form of globalization is not all roses, as it still has what I would consider to be some notorious failures. The most important one is that it doesn't consider how unequal relationships become when everyone must adapt to the quote-unquote global culture. With English being adopted as the main language, we get a peek into how this global culture is in fact a mirror of what powerful similar countries think. It is no surprise that they, along with some educated, globally minded people outside of this sphere, thrive under globalism. The problem with the current state is that the world is too diverse for everyone to adapt to the same cultural way to interact. Either way, people ask, how can we even start addressing this flaw? The big problem is the lack of cultural representation and variety within our current view of globalism, which stems into smaller issues like how everyone must speak English in an international context, and how cultural expectations seem to be westernized, particularly Eurocentric and US/Canada based. Well, some people believe that the problem comes from the thought that we need to flatten culture into a single global culture to interact effectively. Well, first, there's no way to represent everyone in this global culture, and even if we try, is there even a need to do this if we just treat everyone respectfully and keep an open mind to what respect means and what it looks like in different contexts?
This is what Planetarity tries to get across. First proposed by Spivak in this article, it argues that the base for interactions is empathy and respect. It points out some perceived flaws of globalism and how little it really represents culture when interacting in an international context. Planetarity tries to accept other cultures as a respectable being that should not be forced to be like your own. Spivak states that we should take globalization as the default way to go in international relationships. She cautions against this since globalization was based on the idea that we were abolishing colonialism, when in reality this is seen through a curated lens of our own context, and up to a certain point it maintains some invincible colonialist effects, since globalization usually caters to Western ideology. This has a negative effect because in international interactions, the powerful one is the base of the interaction and the other must align to it. As an example, we all need to learn English instead of forming a global language, which would come out with some disadvantages since not everything is translatable into words. Check out our other video for a deep dive on this. Spivak proposes that the first step to acknowledging each other is to stop trying to make the others adapt into our own culture in order to fall into an agreement after the initial tensions and disagreements. Spivak also defines planetarity loosely, since Spivak argues that this would just spawn another globalization to follow, which is why she encourages us to use the concept of planetarity as a guide for many facets of the human being, be it ecology, relationships, etc., with a base of respect and empathy for others, which I must say I couldn't agree more with the idea. Regarding planetarity and planetarism, my brother and his girlfriend pose two interesting ideas. The first one being that a colonizer's culture is now part of the culture of the colonized, and vice versa, albeit to a lesser degree. The history of the colonized is lost and will never be reclaimed effectively. It is lost to time and neither destroyed or heavily altered, and at that point, a new culture emerges. And what purpose does that original history serve when it is no longer the context in which you develop yourself in? While it is important to know your history in order to avoid repeating the same mistakes and learning from the past, but for example, me learning that Spain colonized Mexico shows me that colonizing and genocide are bad and shouldn't be allowed. But it shouldn't give me a newfound hatred for Spain since they conquered my ancestors years ago. And while I do feel bad for my ancestors, I shouldn't have any grudges against Spanish people just because of what they did in the past. Either way, the second idea asks about when we should care about what other cultures think. And in this case, we reach the conclusion that it depends. We should be careful of external opinions when learning about our own country and context, but in an international context, or even in the case of double nationalities, we should be analytical with the opinions that we receive, since other cultures may not understand the reason behind certain cultural aspects that we possess. That being said, my brother and I have different experiences in international and national contexts, which is why each of us will give a bit of our experience and opinion now.
Well, for my university experience, I have seen firsthand how many expectations we have on international interactions. In my cohort of only 130 people, we represent around 50 countries, yet we tend to interact in English even when some share a native language. Similarly, our interactions and general values as a cohort feel very much based on US standards when interacting with someone that we share little to no context with, seeing it as a safe bet instead of trying to understand each other. It might be because we're a US-based university, but even then, we think of ourselves as a global cohort and a global-minded university. I feel I have learned a lot from people and their cultural background and context, yet I see too little in our interactions that it feels everyone, or at least most people, had a similar background. Particular to my university context, it feels like there isn't as much of a cultural divide by country, as many people come from international schools, or at least have had a similar international experience. The flattening comes from this shared experience. Similarly, most of us are quite privileged within our country, although some more so than others, and even privilege in a country is seen very differently in different countries. It is not that surprising to think that our context is not just our country, but also our context within our country. In the latter, it seems that many of us have shared experiences, leading to ideological similarities, even if these ideologies change how we are perceived in our own country. Still, when I interact in a more reduced group, I feel how much we differ, and how much we can mutually learn from each other. So, is it really necessary to have a shared cultural background to interact globally, as the current globalist solution proposes? Well, maybe unimportant interactions like trading goods may be more appropriate, maybe even necessary. But when you really want meaningful interactions, when you want to learn from each other and have different backgrounds, be it national identities or something else like socioeconomic status, why should we expect everyone to align to the same standards? My experience makes me wonder whether these global interactions are based on a conscious suppression of our context for a more comfortable experience, or an unconscious suppression because it is all we know on how to interact globally. Perhaps we choose to share who we are in this sense. Depending on the scenario and our own values, we decide who we want to be and what we want out of our interactions.
In my limited international experiences, I have encountered pretty much nothing but positive experiences. People are curious about my culture, I'm curious about theirs, and it's all friendly dialogue. But interestingly, I have present a lot of judgment when talking about other cultures within my own culture. Things like, this group of people doesn't shower daily, or this other culture allows children to marry old men, etc. etc. And while I think that daily showers are a must, and I don't think that it is correct for children to be forced into marriage, I think it's important that we all have a baseline of respect and empathy. Again, I do not condone some activities or thoughts in certain groups, and I'm not saying they should be tolerated either. From what I understand, Planetarity doesn't imply this either. It proposes that we should offer people the opportunity to live along with other people with whom they share their values with, whether it is traditional or unconventional. As long as you are aware that you are not forced to live a certain way, and people are free to choose the culture they develop themselves with, I think that's fine, as long as they're not hurting other groups, of course. That being said, I think we should have a bit more empathy and more openness to different cultures, as much as we disagree with their practices, which is what Planetarity aims for. I believe my opinion varies from Pucci's because my experience is more limited and in a more casual aspect. People in hotels or vacations or in places where one goes with the purpose of interacting with other cultures. And while that might be the case for my brother's school as well, it is likely overtaken by the pressure of maintaining an image and a professional relationship in the future.
Well, this was a rather long video, even longer than usual, but I think it captures why discussing equality is so complicated. There are simply too many facets to it. We should note that we did not even address all types of equality, and that even the arguments we discussed and provided were limited. Although research did take a while, and was quite in-depth, we had to cut down some things too. When talking about inequality, we think it is important to address the type we're talking about, and seeing how to solve it in different ways, both theoretically and practically, knowing there is no perfect solution, and that there are very fair arguments for and against solutions. As we saw, not even cosmopolitans can agree with each other, and planetarity is purposefully defined loosely as to avoid the problems of rigidness in globalism. As we know, even if we all think there's a correct way to do things, it is highly difficult to fully agree on everything, regardless of our cultures. Fortunately, the core of equality still stands for most of our moral compasses. It is empathy. Our ability to coexist respectfully and effectively relies on empathy. And the more informed we are about culture, the more we can empathize and push forward our sense of equality and justice in all contexts. To put it simply, we just try our best, and when informed, our best is the closest it can be to having effective and meaningful interactions. But this requires a collective effort and care for equality and justice, which is what we should strive for as humans. Putting equality and justice at the forefront of humanity solves many problems, all stemming from being unable to empathize with those we are less connected and informed about, failing to see how we are in fact closer to each other than we think, and even when not, seeing the validity and importance of difference, a reference to that individuality video, as something we can respect that helps humanity grow.